Make sure all looks good. Perfect. All right, everyone. Welcome to another ARCS chat. My name is Robin Bauer-Kilgo. I am the Association Manager for ARCS. Before we get started in today's very exciting conversation on fire, I wanted to let you guys have some information that there is a bit of a delay between when we talk and when this actually gets ported out to YouTube. So heads up on that. If you want to participate in the chat, please make sure you are signed in to your Google or YouTube account. And also for ARCS, we're going to have a thing called a military meetup on November 17th at 7 p.m. Eastern. So if you're interested in joining and talking to other folks who deal with military collections, go over to our website, arcsinfo.org, and you can sign up to be a part of that meeting. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off my mic for just a little bit and hand the start of this conversation over to John Robinette and Becca Kennedy.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to another edition of ARCS Chat, and thanks for bearing with our week delay because of elections here in the United States. We do hope that everybody is healthy and safe at the moment as we continue to experience our, lockdown situations. So today, yes, we're going to discuss fire preparation and prevention, but more importantly, we're going to talk about the ways in which we misunderstand our current methods. So joining us to discuss this is Michael Kilby, the Associate Director for Fire Protection at the Smithsonian, Washington, D.C. Betsy Severance, the Head Registrar at the Getty in Los Angeles. And Jared Yax, Firefighter and Collections Curator and Off-Site Facilities Manager at the Tri-Cities Historical Museum in Grand Haven, Michigan. Firefighter and collections person. I mean, what a unicorn. So lastly, but not leastly, joining us to co-host today is Rebecca Kennedy, Independent Registrar in Washington, D.C., and also the chair of the ARCS Programming Subcommittee and Collections Emergency Specialist. So as Robin mentioned, please, if you have any questions for the panel as we continue our conversation, put that in the chat, sign into your Google or Gmail account and throw it on up there. Let us know where you're from. And without any further ado, let's get started. My first question I have is for Michael, and wanted to take kind of a macro perspective on things. So can you tell us about some historic fires that maybe have changed how we approach fire prevention and how they've affected that change?
Okay, yeah, I was giving some thought to this, and unfortunately, there's no shortage of museum fires that we can learn from. And just about every year, there's a major museum fire, and just in the United States alone, we have about 70 museum fires a year. So, but most of them, don't make the headlines. One of the first fires I thought of was the Museum of Modern Art in Rio de Janeiro that had a fire back in 1978. 90% of the collections were destroyed in that fire. They believed it was caused by either a cigarette or an electrical fault. Didn't have any sprinklers, didn't have smoke detection, didn't have fire separations. But one of the main lessons we learned from that fire was, the building was non-combustible construction, concrete, glass, and steel. And there was, an attitude that, well, this building's not going to burn because it's non-combustible. Unfortunately, that was a real misconception because, the contents of the museum and the collections are combustible. And that's why they lost 90% of their collections. Another fire I thought about was the San Diego Aerospace Museum. I think that was back in 1988. I think it was 1988, actually. I'm not sure, maybe 1978. Sorry, can't remember now. But it was about $16 million loss. The building was wood and stucco. The museum was totally destroyed by fire. The only collection that was left over was a piece of moon rock. Everything else was destroyed. And there was an assumption that, the fire department responded within 4 minutes of the fire being reported, but still the entire museum was destroyed. So, no matter how quickly your fire department can respond, how close they are, that was a misconception that well, we're right next to the fire department. We're going to be okay. We don't need to do anything else. And then closer to home for me was our Museum of American History at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. We had probably one of our most severe fires in 1970. The museum was relatively new, probably less than 5 years old. And we had an electrical fire in an exhibit hall. Back then we didn't put sprinklers in our museums. We didn't have smoke detection. We did, however, have firewalls, and what we call passive fire protection, where we divided up the building into sections using fire-rated construction. That fire did about $1 million worth of damage. We had smoke spread throughout the museum, but the fire was contained to one exhibit hall. And it was contained because we had fire-rated walls and we had a set of fire doors that were closed to prevent the fire from spreading to the rest of the museum. So there's some examples of fires that we've learned from in the past.
Those are super interesting. What I found especially interesting was that they're all decades old, meaning that they had a strong chance of influencing. Like, for example, my first thought was, you mentioned that several of these didn't have sprinklers or smoke detectors. When did that become common?
I think it's still becoming common.
Really?
And it really depends on what I find is it really depends on who you talk to out in the museum world. I think there's still a lot of misconceptions about sprinklers, and I still hear comments like, well, what's worse, fire or having sprinklers discharge?
Yeah.
And sometimes you even see that in news articles where the press says, well, thank goodness they didn't have sprinklers, because then we would have water damage too.
Right.
But I think for us, the eye opener was that American History Museum fire. And after that, that's when actually the Smithsonian started their fire protection program, which, that's what I run now. And that's when we start to retrofit all of our buildings, including the historic ones, with sprinklers. I think the U.S. Is adopting, the concept of protecting museums with sprinklers faster than some other parts of the world, from what I see. I think in Europe, they still put more emphasis on fire prevention than on fire suppression.
Mm-hmm.
And they do a great job with fire prevention. So it's different in different parts of the world.
So, as this is sort of a setup question, because the next part of it is the, what you're actually, very famous for. I don't know if you know how famous you are, but,
I didn't know I was famous.
No, yeah, you were part of the team that developed the NFPA 909 fire code, which I'm kind of curious if some of that code came out of some of these historic fires. Can you tell us about what that code is and how maybe it developed?
Sure. Well, I mean, that code definitely was developed long before I joined the committee. But so NFPA is National Fire Protection Association, and they have probably a couple hundred codes, at least a few hundred codes on various things. But and there's a committee that develops each of these codes. The committee I'm on is called the Cultural Resources Committee, and we actually have two codes we're responsible for. One is NFPA 909. That's this code right here. And it's the code for protection of cultural resource properties. And that includes museums, libraries, and places of worship. The other code that we're responsible for is NFPA 914. And that's the code for the protection of historic structures. Now I went back through the history. That code was used to be called the protection of our heritage. and it was first published, I think, in 1948, so long before my time. I couldn't identify a specific fire or event that spurred the creation of that code. Not like some other codes like life safety code. There's specific fires that really spurred the development of those codes. But I can tell you from my experience on being on the committee is that, these, especially these major fires, definitely have an impact on the committee and what goes into the code. We try to learn from each of these fires and make sure that the guidance in the code is addressing the hazards and the risks that museums face.
Does insurance, how does that code respond to insurance and vice versa?
Oh, okay. So
everyone else on this as well too, because Betsy, for example, and Jared, in your institutions, you're probably dealing with similar constraints between balancing insurance requests and requirements as well. So
that's a great question, and maybe before I actually answer that, let me just backtrack a little bit on that code. So each of these codes, including the NFPA 909, are considered a consensus code. So the committee that develops a code comes from various sectors of society. Like I'm considered, as Smithsonian, we're considered a user of that code, but we also have authorities having jurisdiction, fire department personnel like Jared. We have people from the insurance industry on that code. We have people from fire protection system manufacturers on that code. So they really try to have a balanced cross section of society in terms of providing input in developing that code. I know we have one representative from Chubb Insurance on our committee. So we do get input from the insurance industry. And actually, when we revise the code, we put it out for public input as well. So anyone can provide input on these codes. So I look at us as, our committee kind of partnering with insurance. One thing to point out is that, the purpose of NFPA 909 is to protect not only your building, but your contents and your continuity of operations, which is different than your normal just building codes that everyone has to follow. Your building codes are concerned with two things: firefighter safety and life safety. You do get some benefits of property protection from it, but that is not a goal of your national building codes. So that's why we advocate for museums to use the NFPA 909.
So Michael, I think the 909 is a great resource for prevention. And I think it provides a lot of insight into things we don't think about, like how to store our material, even our storage material, egresses, things like that are very specific to cultural institutions. But I'd be interested to hear from Betsy and Jared about if they've applied this to their cultural institution, and if so, how does it affect Betsy with wildfires, as well as Jared with just regular collections management as a firefighter? Have you used these codes? Have they provided you any comfort?
I guess I'll jump in. Yeah, I'll jump in. So I as a chief registrar, I personally haven't had direct relationship to that code. I'm sure the Getty facility and et cetera have worked closely with it. So I can't really speak to that exactly, but I can agree that we do work closely with our underwriters to make sure all the necessary precautions are taking place, all the necessary preparations, facility maintenance with roofs, sprinkler systems, the grounds, tree trimming, brush clearing, staff training, ensuring that we have a defensible space around the museum buildings. And we obviously try and follow any suggestions that they might have. That helps to keep our insurance premiums as low as possible as well. So that is the benefit. And you guys said you do kind of pay, you either pay higher premiums or you pay to invest into your building and into your community and the protection of the cultural objects, under our roof. Obviously, the last thing anybody wants is an insurance claim, so we certainly do want to follow those recommendations in terms of what's been learned from the past, from different experiences. And as we know, the artworks can't be replaced, but so it's really better to invest in the facility and in the staff training and all.
So is that sort of a three-way conversation between you, your insurance and your underwriters and the facilities?
Definitely. I would throw in there the grounds folks as well, and local, first responders, local fire department.
Yeah.
Which is a great turnover to Jared, because Jared is a anomaly of a firefighter and a collections care professional. So
everything in one.
Yes, the unicorn.
With the NFPA standards, think about it that if you're not following those standards, you're pretty much actively hindering any type of rescue or preservation effort for your institution. You've got all these people that come together and with this knowledge saying, this is what you need to do to help give your museum or institution its best fighting chance to preserve your collection in the case of emergency. And if you're not following that, you're really making the job harder for the first responders, and putting your museum at a greater loss then, which is going to cost you more in insurance. So it really does kind of help to study kind of those guidelines, and then making sure that you're implementing them in your institutions. That way, if and when you do have an emergency, you'll have the best case outcome for it. So.
Jared, yesterday when we were talking briefly to prepare for this, you had a great insight into how when we ask the firefighters to come and tour our storage facilities, we are wholly focused on protecting our collections, but we don't often focus on the firefighter standpoint. So can you provide some insight into that?
Yep. When you first hear about, a firefighter, he's the guy that goes and puts the wet stuff on the red stuff, goes home, right? So it's quite a bit more complicated, of course. So thinking about when the firefighter department comes in, you got guys that are coming in wearing anywhere from like 80 to 120 pounds of gear. It's like putting a snowsuit on, and then you're going to go run into an oven. So you're limited. You've got your air pack on, and the bottles can last, they say, anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour, depending on the size of the air bottle that's in your back. When in reality, and you're working hard, you may only have about 10 to 20 minutes at best. So, and that's to make your way in, find the fire, fight it, and then make your way out again. So, and with the conditions in these buildings, when we go into a fire, we're doing everything by touch and feel, because there's generally so much smoke, you can't see more than a couple inches in front of your mask or your shield there. So we're crawling on the ground because of the thermal layering in the fire. Down where we're crawling around, it's only a couple hundred degrees, but you get up near the ceiling, it's well over 1,000 degrees in a well-involved fire. These large, like storage facilities or museums, are generally the most dangerous places for firefighters to actually work. When you can't see, imagine going into a different collections building that's completely foreign to you. You don't know the layout of it. Before you do, they're going to blindfold you, take you in the middle of it, and then spin you around and tell you, find your way out in 10 minutes. That's if you lose your hose line and you don't know the way out, it could be incredibly scary and dangerous. That if you run out of air, your life is in jeopardy there. So that's when we would end up calling a mayday. So going into these large structures like this, it can be, if you're not well trained, or if you don't know the structure very well and you get separated from your crew or your hose line, it can be very scary. So when you're thinking about, well, maybe these firefighters can just run in and help grab some items or grab something, they're not really worried about grabbing stuff. They're looking for that fire, and as soon as you start putting water on that fire and putting the fire out, everything gets better. So that's what they're going to focus on. We're primarily going to worry about life safety and then preservation of property. So, but the sooner we get water on that fire, the better conditions get, the safer things get for us.
So can I ask, do these codes take into account the things that you're saying? So for example, if we're concerned about the size of an egress, for example, does that, say, have a dual purpose? Yeah, a person can exit, but also that allows, say, clearance for a hose or any of that stuff. Does that take the firefighting into account?
a lot of times we'll want to, if at all possible, control an entry point or an exit point. As soon as when we're starting to get into the fire science kind of things, but when you open or close a door, you're altering flow paths for a fire. So the fire is going to want to find oxygen and fuel, and then the heat source is what gets it going. So if it finds oxygen by someone opening a door or breaking out a window, the fire is going to go towards that flow path and it's going to grow. So if we can control those doors and kind of compartmentalize the collection, that makes life easier for us. So, and the codes, I know, generally dictate like where you have different fire exits, so that way people can get out of the building. If we have everyone out of the building and we can just focus on the fire and we don't have to worry about rescue efforts, that makes life a lot easier for us as well.
I think purchasing the NFPA 909 and the 914, depending on your structure, is a fantastic investment for any institution. It's a dull read, but it's worth the effort. So please, everyone watching this, look into that. But I think talking about, oh, go ahead, Michael.
Sorry, and just so you know, you can get free access now to the NFPA codes, including 909, 914, online access. So I think we're going to share with all of the participants a link to that free access. Exciting.
But talking about like these structures and these barriers and these safety precautions we put into ourselves, I want to ask Betsy, wildfires make the news. They are very traumatic, and the Getty is setting the standard for how to respond to wildfires. So my question is for you is, besides what you've already mentioned, what are some ways you've been able to get prepared for a wildfire, especially institutional buy-in?
Sure. Well, the preparation really has started with the facility. I mean, this facility was constructed, the Getty Center, that is, specifically in the mid-90s with fire prevention at the forefront of the building plan. The architects and the planners understood the realities of building in Southern California, a unique hilltop location, annual fire seasons and Santa Ana winds, very dry brush. We get no rain from April to November usually. So I think they had to make a good plan from the very start. Fire resistive materials, including the travertine cladding, the crushed stone on the roof, the road that encircles the buildings to create a defensible space. Also, of course, you know, good fire suppression inside, landscape irrigation on the outside has been huge for us. We are able to water our hillsides actively and basically saturate the plants. Happily, that exterior sprinkler systems can be activated remotely. In other words, some staff doesn't have to risk life and limb to come on site and get in the way of first responders. Are able to activate those the irrigation systems remotely from their home, from their phone, obviously. They've also built a 1 million gallon water tank to supply both the interior and the exterior sprinkler systems. They've thought through very carefully the plants around the building to try to have moisture-rich plants. We also do a lot of preparation throughout the year, including very definitely scheduled grass and tree clearing, pruning, brush clearing, tree trimming, I should say, making sure there's not dead leaves, dead plants, pine needles. All of that is fuel that can catch embers. So we work very hard to make sure that those are clear. We cleared gutters. We cleared trash left at loading docks. We could make sure that all our eaves are closed with a mesh that no embers can enter the eaves. We are very vigilant to weather forecasts. Any red flag warning, which the Southern Californians will know well, the exterior irrigation is started right away. We soak the plants and the hillsides. And put other precautions into place. From a collections management perspective, we even at those red flag warnings often run a lot of our emergency collections management reports for the collection and exhibitions, loans, et cetera. And we are proactive about running all those emergency reports and saving them in a variety of locations so that, again, we can be prepared if, you know, long before we kind of have to be prepared. On the inside, we've got the 4-hour fire doors and walls, the self-contained building modules, good fire suppression system. We also have a lot of extra components on site if we need them to keep things going. We can change the HVAC system so it cycles through existing air or pushes air out as opposed to pulling air in, so we don't bring smoke into the building. We identify doors. As you know, at the Getty, a lot of the doors open out into the central courtyard. So we have a lot of outdoor exterior doors, not into the public, but into the into the central part. And so those, we identify specific doors that will be used if we have to use them, and all the rest are taped shut so that it's communicated to the few staff that's on site at that point to which doors they can and can't use. But the security staff trains regularly for these scenarios. We can talk later at another point too. We do a lot of tabletop exercises, which really gets the staff comfortable with the process, the knowledge, the passwords, the documents, who does what, and when do you do it, in what order. Again, saving documents to different locations has been a big part of that. I think those are the highlights.
Actually, I think now would be a great time for you to tell us about what type of training and tabletops you go through. And I think it'd be great to hear from all three of our panelists what type of training they institute from their positions. So Betsy, we can start with you, if you don't mind.
Sure. So we, even before, even several years ago, we started doing tabletop exercises even before the 2017 Skirball fire, but it's become even more necessary, useful, appreciated. So we sort of have an envelope that's got a scenario in it, and that the envelope is opened and a scenario is announced. And it can be anything from time of day, day of the week. Do you have public on site? Do you have an indemnified show on site? Do you have key staff traveling in other parts of the country or other parts of the world? So we do this and we try and even confirm, what are your passwords to those external cloud accounts? Who's where, who's calling who, in what order are we doing things, who's prepping information to go to the press, to go to our colleagues who are curious and supportive from afar, but we want to make sure we're communicating efficiently, and we want to know who's doing that, and again, and in what order. So those tabletop exercises have been really hugely helpful in getting people comfortable and confident with the process and the location of things and who does what. So they've been great. We do it with earthquakes as well, and those are our two main problems that we have here. So we have earthquake moments as well as fire moments.
And are these tabletops mandatory for attendance, or are they just come when people can, or do you have good buy-in, I guess is what I'm asking.
I really pushed for it to be two groups. One is just within the registrar's department. So I want our collections managers, I want everybody in my department to know who's doing what, who's calling who, what we need from each person, how they can help, how they can communicate. And then there's larger ones too within the institution, which include facilities, security, representative, art handlers, conservation, curatorial, and administration. So that, and usually mandatory representatives from those groups, not everybody, because it just becomes too big. But usually those larger ones, can be about 20, 25 people. And just to talk it through and to really get that comfort level. I think mandatory makes it sound, I think everybody's invested in the success. So I don't think this much arm twisting is required. So. Great.
Michael, what type of training do you and your staff do for cultural heritage professionals?
Well, two things, I guess. First, we've been walking the fire department through each of our museums to make sure they are familiar with the buildings, familiar with the hazards, as Jarrett was pointing out. We walk them through the collection storage spaces. have discussions with them on, how would they approach a fire in those areas? Is there anything that they could modify in terms of their approach to reduce the damage to collections, from a firefighting standpoint? So that's been going well, and we've been doing that over the past couple years, actually. We have a separate emergency management office that's been leading that. And we've learned things from the fire department that, things that we never thought of, just hearing their perspective, whether it's signage or it's identifying hazards. So that's been very informative for us, and it just builds that cooperative relationship between Smithsonian and the fire department. And then on a different side, we've been partnering with our central collections office, working with the collections community across the Smithsonian on training on fire response and recovery. And Beck, I think you've participated in some of this in the past too. We've done 2 live burns at a test facility, like full-scale room fire, where we simulate a fire in a collection storage space. And we invite not just collection staff, but we invite our security staff, our facility staff, and other staff at Smithsonian, so we can develop a coordinated response when the real thing happens.
Which works did you burn in that?
Okay, John, I'm sorry.
Which works did you burn in that? Sorry.
Only mock collections. Only mock
Yes.
collections in there. But it's pretty realistic. We have, paintings, books. We even had some collections in ethanol, natural history collections in ethanol, and different arrangements too. Open racks, like what's behind you in your private collection there, John.
Yeah.
And closed metal cabinets, open shelves, textiles on open racks too. Just so that we have a variety of objects that, and then the collection staff have to go into the room after the fire once it's cooled down and try to move and recover these objects as best we can. We've also done some experimentation on, we use a variety of different types of shelf liners and dust covers and see how those perform in actual fire.
Are collection staff ever involved in that? I'm thinking about it from the point of view of maybe we should consider this as we store, or maybe we shouldn't store things here or there.
Yes, I think these trainings have spurred a lot of conversation between the collections staff and conservators and others as to, what type of materials should we use to line our shelving? Because, use something that's a foam plastic, it's going to melt and adhere to your collections, and may be very, very difficult to remove. Also, we found that storing collections in closed metal cabinets, as you would expect, provides a lot of protection for the collections. So we certainly advocate for using closed metal cabinets when that's possible.
Right. If I could just, with these projects we
Absolutely.
did, we housed things in many different materials, from plastics to Nomex to Tyvek to anything you possibly think of. And so when we set this on fire, we were not just looking at how the objects responded, we looked at how the objects responded with the typical rehousing material you would see within a collection facility. And it was very eye-opening, but at the same time, we still had to evaluate our risk. Is our risk primarily mishandling? So we still need to use the ethafoam, or is our risk mainly fire, which melts during a fire, or ethafoam melts during fire. So it has spurred a lot of discussion. So there's a video we can share with people.
Oh, yes.
But Michael, can you also talk about fire extinguisher training?
Oh, sure. So we offer fire extinguisher training to any staff at Smithsonian that want it. Certainly all of our security officers, who are typically the first to respond to a fire, are required to get extinguisher training. For the rest of our staff, it's really on if they request it, we provide it. We certainly tell our staff that, only fight a fire if you're trained and if you're comfortable. And one of the key things with fire extinguishers and using them is to know what extinguisher can handle and what it can't. In the training, we always say, a small office type trash can fire is about the limit for a fire extinguisher. Most extinguishers only give you about 30 seconds of firefighting capability, and then you spent the entire contents of the extinguisher.
Great.
Jared, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Part of it too is just thinking about the different types of extinguishers that are out there. They have their advantages or disadvantages. The misting or foaming extinguishers are great at like penetrating, get down into the seat of the fire and cool it down where the stuff is actually burning. But again, you're getting everything wet, or you're introducing that foam, which could be potentially kind of caustic to certain materials. The dry chemical ones are also very effective by smothering and blanketing the fire. But then, of course, you're contaminating all your artifacts with that fine powder. CO extinguishers, they don't have any type of agent, so it's probably the cleanest of them. But in the case of like really light things with paper, you got the potential of blowing the fire around, or the embers around a little bit more, and it doesn't necessarily get right into the deep-seated embers of the fire. So that like you were talking about, that training, knowing if you have all three types of extinguishers, when to use them, when the proper time to use each of them is, and when the time to say, well, this is maybe a little bit bigger than what I can handle, so maybe I should just get out too. So
yeah, those are good points. I was back about 10 years ago or so, the 909 committee was getting a lot of questions on the effect of different portable agents on collection materials. And there wasn't much information out there about that. So we ended up starting a project and partnered with the Fire Research Foundation to develop a sort of a standardized test that would evaluate each portable fire extinguishing agent and its effects on various cultural resource materials, whether it's copper, iron, fur, ivory, anything like that. And it's pretty interesting. So we developed a test, and then we tested about, I can't remember the exact number, maybe 12 to 15 different types of materials with various types of agents, CO2, like you mentioned, Jared, water, dry chemical, and then some clean agents as well. And that research paper is going to be, there's going to be a link posted so everyone can see and read up on that. I would think, conservators and others would be pretty interested in that.
For sure. It's an interesting report. Again, a dry document to get through, but full of useful information.
Yeah, I would skip right to the appendix. It has a matrix of all the different types of materials and all the agents and their effect on the on those materials. And one thing to point out is that we had conservators who were part of this project, and they looked at the material after an agent was applied to it. They looked at it immediately afterwards. They looked at it like a few weeks later and a few months later, because sometimes when you have a release of an agent, you may not be able to clean these materials right away, and they may have the agent on them for some time. So we wanted to see what the long-term effects were also.
Yeah, it's an incredibly interesting document for sure. And I believe it's been linked in there, so enjoy, everyone. So we've been answering all of our questions. So I'm going to pick one from the audience. So we have a question is, Michael, you were talking about all those fires at the beginning and the history of fires. And we have, what'd you say, at least one major one a year or month or
that's
frequently?
Worldwide at least.
Right. So what is the percentage of those that are contained effectively versus massive loss? Do you know?
That's a great question. And I don't know if I've ever seen a statistic on that. In the US, we have Enfers, which is a sort of the national fire database that they take all the fire reports from the fire departments and sort of categorize the fires and come up with statistics. But I don't recall seeing, what the success rate is basically. A lot of times the fire is contained, if it's really successfully contained, it may not even make it into that database.
Define contained.
And it depends on what you mean by contained, right? If it's contained to a single space or if it's contained to the object of origin. If it's contained to the object of origin, like it's a cooking fire and you smother it, that'll probably just never get reported. If the fire department shows up, and Jared, you may have more information on this than me. I think if the fire department shows up, then typically it's going to get into the database.
Yeah, if we show up, every action, even if it's a false alarm, goes into that database, and it just depends on what type of alarm. It could be a good intent, it could be a mistriggered alarm system. So everything that will go into that database, but then we kind of classify it as just a small cooking fire, or it could be a room and contents fire, partial floor fire, all the way up to a fully involved structure, which means everything's on fire. So it's that Enfers that you're talking about lets us kind of break down so that we can see how far did the fire really travel and how intense was it. So.
Oh, that's interesting. I guess there's no real definition of the word "quote unquote" contained, which I was unaware of.
Containment is stopping the fire from spreading and then extinguishing it, going through overhaul and making sure that there's no extension. And then at that point, we're just clean up and head out. So.
Okay. Well, I'm going to revert us back to collections care. So we all have to fill out, most institutions fill out a general facilities report, which asked about our fire prevention methods. And one of the things that comes up is a lot of institutions still do not have sprinkler systems, or they rely heavily on fire extinguishers. And they've had loans rejected because they don't have fire sprinkler systems. So overall, do you feel like a building is less safe because it doesn't have a sprinkler system? And if not, are there cheap methods people can do to prevent fires? Or how do we feel about this in general?
Who do you want to answer first?
All of you. Whoever is willing to take first.
I'd say that if a building is not sprinkled, there's no fire suppression system, your collections, your building is at a little bit more of a risk. As technology progresses, we're starting to see alternatives to water systems. And I don't know the science behind or the statistics behind a lot of them. Maybe Michael, but stuff like there's these fireballs that are produced by AFO that when they heat up to a certain temperature, they'll burst and throw this chemical agent all over around them in the immediate area. So that's an alternative to a wet system. There are different ways to be able to push CO2 into a room if a fire is detected. So, but and again, Michael, maybe a little bit more about some of those systems, but I'm just starting to hear about them and learn some of this new technology. So,
yeah, some of those alternatives, I'd say, may be appropriate for areas where you don't typically have personnel, especially like CO2, of course, from an asphyxiation standpoint. And I don't have much experience. I've heard of the fireballs, and I don't even know what they're called officially. I have heard of those, and I think I've heard of them being used in maybe some remote facilities, where you don't have any water available. Also, water mist is something that we haven't put any water mist systems into any Smithsonian buildings yet, but I know National Gallery of Art has put it into some of their galleries. So it is water-based, but uses a fraction of the amount of water that a sprinkler system uses. Of course, there are probably more maintenance because you're using high-pressure pumps and high-pressure piping systems for these water mist systems. On the question of the risk of putting collections in a non-sprinkler building, I certainly agree with Jared that you are at a higher risk. Even when you factor in the risk of water damage, I think you're at a much higher risk. You know, if you have a fire in a building, the fire department comes in, uses hoses, they're going to be using 10 to 50 times as much water as what a sprinkler system would use. Sprinklers are going to, typically most fires are put out with 1 or 2 sprinklers. And, you know, sprinklers are putting out maybe 30 to 50 gallons per minute, generally speaking. So that's really a small amount of water. And one thing I always just like to point out is that I don't think I've ever seen a sprinklered museum destroyed by fire. If a building is fully sprinklered, at most you might lose the contents of, you know, part of a room, but you're not going to lose an entire collection or entire museum.
Betsy, what about, yeah, you all have an active loan program.
We do, and we do a thorough review of those general facility reports and focus heavily on the fire prevention section of those reports. We do note when they don't have sprinkler systems and try and understand how they will solve it. Everything that Jared and Michael have said makes sense, and I agree with, of course, but we do try and keep the loan process going, and we do try and take a holistic approach on the venue, the potential borrower, and try and understand their whole approach to everything that they do, and are they, you know, invested in you know, a professional professional standards in terms of security and HVAC and staff training. And it's just, we try and sort of understand the whole picture, not any one aspect of it in that way, and try and then make a considered decision about the object, value, role in the collection, uniqueness, things like that. So we try and you know, be thoughtful about the whole picture. But it's a very valid point about sprinklers being so key.
Great. John, you want to do one last summary question for everybody?
Sure. Summary question, huh? I mean, look, there's so much to discuss here, but I mean, look, let's start with Jared with this, but like ultimately, what is a step that every museum could take tomorrow to make them better prepared and safer from fire? And I want to start with Jared too, because I want to make sure that we address the capabilities of institutions that don't have maybe the size and the scope and the resources of a Getty or a Smithsonian.
I'd have to say it's you know, knowledge and training are going to be your most important thing. My grandma, she's a great lady, she was talking with her friends, and of course she's proud of all of her grandkids and great grandkids, but she was telling her friends what we do and that I'm a firefighter, and the person asked her, well, what kind of a guy runs into a burning building? And she told him, a well-trained one. And that's true. We train constantly to do this type of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Museums should be doing the same thing. You should be training and try to increase your knowledge base as much as possible, as often as possible. Training should include, if your museum doesn't have an incident command system for these types of disasters, you need to learn about it and start to implement that immediately. The hardest thing with managing a disaster is managing your people and resources, and that's what the incident command system does so well. Fire department uses it all the time, and it can apply very easily to the museum world. I was up in Midland for when the flooding happened up there, trying to help rescue some of the collections for those museums. And by using that incident command system, we were able to manage over 300 volunteers and we moved and saved tens of thousands of artifacts within 4 days. And the only reason we were able to do that so efficiently was that incident command system. The other thing then too is just getting together with your local fire department, talking to them, offering to have a training. Like with my department, we'll do walkthroughs of certain buildings or industries or large structures. That way we can see what it looks like on the inside, and then their safety people will be able to kind of pick our brains and say, hey, what do we do in these certain situations? So if you can get the fire department in there and then give them a tour so that way they can see what the inside looks like, it'll make them more effective at finding a fire if there is one, and then also makes them feel a little bit safer. Letting them kind of, or telling them what is in your collections then too, so that way they understand the various hazards and threats. Like you get some of these older clothing, textile collections that have arsenic and mercury and formaldehyde in them. Knowing that that's a hazmat situation. So even after the fire, the firefighters know to decon their gear to make sure that they're not getting sick later on. Talking with those guys when they're in there and understanding the flow paths within your museums. That way you know how the fire would behave in your building. Understanding the different types of smoke damage, where when you get that black smoke from incomplete combustion versus the whiter, lighter smoke from complete combustion, and how to clean or how to not damage your artifacts worse by grabbing something and grinding that soot and smoke into them. Trying to compartmentalize your collection as much as possible, so that way you're stopping the fire from spreading nearly as quickly. Even if it's just a simple hollow core door, and making sure you close it every time, that'll buy your department 10 to 15 more minutes to put that fire out before it breaks into the next room. So these trainings are just incredibly important. And then the more you know about what to do in the situation, the more you'll be able to save, and the safer your collection will be.
Michael, any last thoughts? What can we do that can change our situation just right now?
Well, I totally agree with what Jared was saying about training and fire prevention. And typically fire prevention is sort of the lowest hanging fruit. There's a lot you can do in terms of your operations and training that are really low cost. One other thing I just wanted to mention was that in NFPA 909, it steps you through a process of developing a protection plan. So it's sort of a step-by-step process where museum professionals can work with museum management and develop a protection plan that helps you define what your goals and objectives are in terms of fire protection or protecting your collections in your museum. Helps you do a vulnerability assessment. Whether it's maybe your greatest vulnerability is the wildfire, or maybe it is an old electrical system, faulty electrical system. It helps you develop what your vulnerabilities are, look at that, and then develop a strategy for addressing them. And a lot of that is going to be fire prevention, whether it's controlling ignition sources, it's managing the combustibles in your museum, exhibit construction, addressing how you handle special events. Special events can impose new hazards that you don't normally have on everyday occurrence in your museums. So it kind of gives you a sort of a way to do a structured approach to fire prevention, fire protection.
Betsy, any last advice from your experience, especially if it's wildfire related?
Everything that Jared and Michael just said, I totally agree with, in terms of having the fire, working closely with your local fire department, doing the walkthroughs. All agreed. Preparation, training, all true. From just a slightly different angle, after an event, we have found to be incredibly helpful is a debrief. You get all the right people around the table: security, facilities, collections, art handlers, administration. You get them around the table, and you say what worked, what didn't. Record it in a way that you can find it later. Train based on the lessons learned, and that has been a huge benefit to the Getty. Between the 2017 Screwball fire and the 2019 Getty fire, we had those moments, and we learned so much. Nothing focuses the mind like having a situation where you had it came close enough to really focus everyone's attention on the training, again, on the facility. We've also had a lot of staff turnover as certain folks have, retired. So it becomes a moment with new staff. You had to retrain, have that conversation with the new folks to make sure that they knew what their role was, both, at every level and in every department. So the debriefs have been hugely helpful.
Thanks so much. Robin, any last comments from our chat that we should be aware of?
Had a couple people ask some questions, which we've been throwing around a lot of links in the chat. So that's been fun to try to keep up with that because there's so many good resources out there. So that's been kind of fun to take up with. Someone just added also that it is hard to overemphasize the importance of keeping fire doors closed for reducing fire risk, which I think that's something that is good to push if you have access to fire doors for sure.
Yeah, we also got a question about wet pipe versus dry pipe. And Michael, I know you could talk interminably about that. So instead, we linked them to your C2CC lecture you gave a few months ago.
Oh, good.
Since we don't have much time left.
Yeah,
Great.
That question is a good one, but both Becca and I were kind of like, that's a long discussion for the last 10 minutes. So we're not sure if this is the time to really talk about that.
Right, but it is an important topic. And Michael has done a C2CC talk about this, which is now linked in the chat box. So please check that out to learn more about fire prevention. So, I mean, since we're close on time, John, I'll just say thank you for having me and letting me represent the ARCS Emergency Programming Subcommittee. Please, look out for more of our programming. We're trying to do one program a month. So look on ARCS social media, read the ARCS updates. We're always trying to make a splash to help you all be better prepared. But also, I can't thank the panelists enough. And I'm going to let John really thank you, but thank you so much from me and my committee.
Thanks so much to everybody. So I do want to say, I want to reiterate that, the video, as you watch it back, the chat will be available. So if you're missing the links, it'll remain up there. Also, we'll add the links when we post the podcast. So they'll be in the podcast description as well. So yes, let's once again, thank you so much to the panelists, Michael, Jared, Betsy, and our special co-host, Becca, and Robin as always. So remember to hit the subscribe button for our YouTube channel so that you get notified every time we go live. Check us out on social media at ARCS for All and Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And we're doing some great Instagram stuff these days, so you definitely want to check that out. Shout out to Virtual Connections Task Force for rocking that. And I think that's basically it for today. The podcast should be out by the end of the week. And with that, thanks so much for joining us and participating in the chat.
And look for one more ARCS chat to happen this year in early December. We'll be back for one more episode of 2020, and then we get to look forward to 2021, people. So let's think positive on that for the next year. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we will see